Some childhoods are remembered with warmth, others are remembered with vigilance. You didn't grow up listening for laughter. You grew up listening for shifts in the air, changes in tone, moments when safety quietly left the room. Before you learned confidence, you learned caution. Before you learned self-expression, you learned restraint. In that house, childhood was not destroyed loudly. It was controlled gently, persistently, until obedience felt safer than honesty and silence felt wiser than truth. You adapted. You survived. You became observant, composed, and prematurely strong. But what no one told you was this: survival is not the same as living, and the patterns that ruled your early years did not disappear when you grew older. They followed you, shaping how you trust, how you speak, how you hesitate at the edge of your own potential. This is not a speech about blame. This is a reckoning, a moment of clarity, a quiet confrontation with the invisible forces that shaped you before you had words for them. Because the moment you understand what controlled your childhood is the moment it loses control over your future. The silence that raised you. Silence is often misunderstood. People imagine it as the absence of noise, the lack of words, the quiet moments between conversations. But in certain childhoods, silence is not empty. It is commanding. It watches. It instructs. It corrects. You did not grow up learning how to speak freely. You grew up learning when not to. You learned that certain questions tightened the air, that certain emotions created distance, that certain truths were better left untouched. So you adapted. Not because you were weak, but because you were intelligent enough to sense danger without it being announced. Silence became your first survival skill. You listened closely, studied expressions, memorized moods. You learned to read rooms before you learned to read books, and in doing so you became careful long before you were confident. In that environment, silence was not neutral, it was instructional. It taught you that safety depended on restraint, that being noticed was risky, that drawing attention to yourself could disturb a fragile balance. So you shrank parts of yourself without even realizing it. Your laughter softened, your curiosity narrowed, your emotions learned to wait their turn. And slowly, quietly, you internalized a dangerous belief. My presence must be managed, not celebrated, not welcomed, managed. This is how silence raises a child, not with cruelty but with constant unspoken correction. No one needed to tell you to behave. You were already monitoring yourself. What makes this kind of upbringing so powerful is that nothing obvious appears broken. There are no dramatic scenes to point to, no single moment that explains everything. Instead, there is atmosphere, tension without explanation, expectations without clarity, emotional distance disguised as normalcy, and the child, lacking comparison, assumes this is simply how life works. You don't question it. You don't resist it, you adjust to it, and that adjustment becomes your personality. You become the easy one, the quiet one, the one who doesn't cause problems. But what the world praises as maturity is often just a child who learned early that self-erasure keeps the peace. As the years pass, silence stops being something imposed from the outside. It becomes internal. You begin to censor yourself even when no one is watching. You rehearse conversations that never happen. You swallow words that deserve air. You doubt your reactions, your feelings, your interpretations. And when asked what's wrong, you instinctively say nothing because you were never taught that your inner world was safe to reveal. This is the long-term effect of a silent upbringing. Not a lack of intelligence, not a lack of strength, but a deep hesitation to take up space. And here is the most overlooked truth. Silence does not mean peace. It means unresolved tension. It means emotions with nowhere to go. It means a nervous system trained to stay alert even in calm moments. Many adults raised this way struggle to relax, not because they are broken, but because calm feels unfamiliar. Stillness feels suspicious. They are productive, responsible, dependable, yet internally restless, always waiting for something to shift, something to go wrong, because silence once meant be careful, not you are safe. This keynote is not about blaming the past. It is about naming it, because what remains unnamed continues to operate quietly. The silence that raised you may have protected you once, but it does not deserve permanent authority over your life. You are allowed to unlearn it, allowed to speak without rehearsing, allowed to feel without apologizing, allowed to take up space without scanning the room for consequences. Awareness is not rebellion, it is liberation. The moment you recognize that your quietness was a response, not your identity, something begins to shift. You realize that the voice you suppressed never disappeared. It waited, patiently, faithfully, for permission. And that permission does not need to come from the past. It comes from you, now. Fear disguised as discipline. Fear rarely announces itself as fear. In many childhood homes, it arrives well-dressed, measured, and calm. It is called discipline. It is called structure. It is called respect. And on the surface, it looks responsible, even admirable. Rules exist. Order is maintained. Boundaries are clearly drawn. But beneath this controlled appearance, something essential is missing: safety. Because true guidance does not rely on intimidation, and true authority does not need constant pressure. Yet the child does not know this. The child only knows that mistakes are costly, that questioning is dangerous, and that obedience is the surest path to peace. So fear settles in quietly, not as terror, but as caution, not as chaos, but as compliance. In such an environment, discipline is not about teaching, it is about control. Instructions are followed without explanation. Expectations are enforced without dialogue. The child learns what to do but never why. And over time, this creates a deep internal conflict. The child becomes skilled at behaving correctly, but disconnected from their own reasoning. Decisions are no longer guided by understanding but by anticipation. What reaction will this cause? What consequence will follow? This is how fear reshapes the mind. It trains the child to think ahead, not in growth, but in avoidance, not in possibility, but in survival. What makes this especially powerful is its subtlety. There may be no shouting, no visible outbursts, no dramatic punishments. Instead, there is tension in the air, disappointment in silence, approval that must be earned. The child becomes highly attuned to signals: a pause, a look, a change in tone. These cues become warnings, and the nervous system responds accordingly. Heart rate adjusts, muscles tighten, words are chosen carefully. Over time, the body learns this pattern so well that fear no longer needs a source. It lives inside. Even when the authority figure is absent, the child continues to regulate themselves as if they are being watched. As adulthood arrives, the structure remains, but the guide is gone. And this is where the damage becomes visible. The adult struggles with decision-making, not because they lack intelligence, but because they were never allowed to practice safe autonomy. They wait for permission that never comes. They fear making the wrong choice, even in low-stakes situations. Authority becomes internalized, harsh, and unforgiving. The voice in their head sounds familiar, critical, impatient, absolute. It does not ask what they want. It asks what they should do. And often, it demands perfection. Fear disguised as discipline also distorts the meaning of self-control. Instead of being a tool for balance, it becomes a form of self-surveillance. The adult monitors their behavior constantly, suppressing spontaneity, censoring emotion, avoiding vulnerability. Joy feels reckless, rest feels undeserved, freedom feels unfamiliar. And when they encounter environments that encourage expression and flexibility, discomfort arises, not because those spaces are unsafe, but because safety was never associated with softness. Calm was conditional, approval was limited. And so the body remains alert, even when the threat is gone. This keynote is not an argument against structure. Structure can be nurturing, boundaries can be protective, but when discipline is fueled by fear rather than understanding, it does not build character. It builds compliance. And compliance, when mistaken for strength, creates adults who appear capable on the outside while doubting themselves internally. They follow rules easily but struggle to trust their own judgment. They respect authority but fear their own autonomy. And often they confuse obedience with morality, never realizing they were taught to avoid punishment rather than pursue wisdom. The most important realization comes when the adult understands this truth. Fear was never proof of discipline working, it was proof of safety missing. And what was learned in fear can be unlearned in awareness. Authority does not have to be loud to be legitimate, and guidance does not have to be rigid to be effective. You are allowed to question without being disloyal. You are allowed to choose without being reckless. You are allowed to make mistakes without being defined by them. When fear loses its disguise, discipline transforms. It becomes intentional rather than reactive, grounded rather than rigid, chosen rather than imposed. And in that transformation, something long denied finally emerges. Trust. Not blind trust in authority, but trust in self. The kind that does not need permission to exist. The kind that stands calmly, even when no one is watching. Love with conditions. Love is meant to be a place of rest, a space where effort ends and belonging begins. But for some children, love was never a constant. It was a currency. It appeared when expectations were met and disappeared when they were not. Approval arrived quietly, sometimes unpredictably, and affection felt less like a gift and more like a reward. The child learned early that connection was not guaranteed. It had to be earned. And so, without anyone ever stating the rule aloud, the child absorbed it deeply. I am lovable when I am useful, agreeable, successful, or silent. This belief did not form in a moment. It formed through repetition, through patterns, through what was given and what was withheld. In homes like this, love is not absent. It is conditional. Praise may exist, but it is selective. Attention may be offered, but it is strategic. Mistakes are remembered longer than efforts. Achievements are acknowledged briefly, then replaced with higher expectations. The child grows vigilant, scanning for signals of approval, measuring their worth by reactions rather than values. Joy becomes cautious, pride feels temporary, and disappointment, even small, feels personal. Because when love has conditions, every failure threatens connection, and every success feels like a test you might not pass again. Over time, this creates a deep internal confusion. The child cannot separate who they are from what they do. Identity becomes performance. Worth becomes productivity. Rest becomes guilt. The child pushes harder, tries more, gives more, not because they are driven by passion, but because they are driven by fear of losing love. And the most painful part is this. From the outside, this child looks exceptional, responsible, high-achieving, polite, mature, but internally they are exhausted, always reaching, never arriving. Because conditional love does not satisfy, it stimulates anxiety. As adulthood unfolds, the pattern follows. Relationships feel familiar when they mirror the past. The adult is drawn to dynamics where affection must be earned, where validation is scarce, where effort is constant. They overextend, overgive, and overfunction, believing that consistency in giving will eventually guarantee security. Boundaries feel selfish. Saying no feels risky, and when affection fades or conflict appears, the old belief returns instantly. I failed. I am not enough. This is not weakness, it is conditioning. A childhood lesson replaying itself in adult form. Love with conditions also distorts self-respect. The adult struggles to value themselves without external confirmation. Compliments feel temporary. Criticism feels absolute. They may appear confident, yet crumble internally at disapproval. Their inner dialogue is transactional. If I succeed, I deserve care. If I struggle, I deserve distance. This is how conditional love creates self-abandonment. The person becomes loyal to others while neglecting themselves. They become dependable to everyone except their own needs. This keynote is not about accusing caregivers. Many imposed conditions unknowingly, repeating patterns they themselves inherited. But understanding the origin does not mean accepting the damage as permanent. Because here is the truth that changes everything. Love that must be earned is not love. It is control dressed as affection. Real connection does not disappear when you rest. It does not withdraw when you fail. It does not require constant proof of worth. And once this truth is recognized, the old contract begins to dissolve. Healing begins when the adult separates worth from performance, when they learn to rest without apology, to set boundaries without guilt, to accept care without proving they deserve it. This does not happen overnight, because the nervous system must relearn safety. But each small act of self-respect weakens the old belief. Each moment of choosing authenticity over approval restores something that was delayed, not lost, but postponed. And then, slowly, something unfamiliar emerges. Love without conditions. It may feel uncomfortable at first, quiet, undemanding, stable, because it does not require vigilance. It does not demand perfection. It does not disappear when you are human. And in that stability, the child who once performed to survive finally learns a new truth. I am enough before I try. I am worthy before I achieve. I am allowed to exist without earning my place. The child who became the adult too soon. Some children do not grow into adulthood. They are pushed into it, not by choice, not by ambition, but by circumstance. While others were learning through play, these children were learning through responsibility. They learned how to read emotional climates, how to anticipate needs, how to prevent conflict before it erupted. Their childhood did not end with a moment. It slowly faded under the weight of expectation. They became reliable because unreliability was not an option. They became strong because weakness had no space to exist. And so, without ceremony or consent, the child stepped into a role meant for someone older, carrying burdens that were never theirs to hold. In such homes, maturity is praised early. The child is called wise, sensible, dependable. These labels feel like recognition, but they come at a cost, because what is being admired is not growth, it is adaptation. The child is not choosing responsibility, they are absorbing it to maintain balance. They become the listener, the mediator, the stabilizer. They learn to suppress their own needs to make room for others. Over time, this suppression becomes automatic. Wanting feels dangerous, asking feels unnecessary, and needing feels like a failure. This is how a child learns to disappear behind competence. The long-term effect of early adulthood is exhaustion that has no clear source. As an adult, they feel tired even in rest, heavy even in calm moments. Joy feels fleeting, responsibility feels endless. They struggle to identify their own desires because they were trained to prioritize everyone else's. Decision-making feels overwhelming, not because they lack ability, but because they were never allowed to choose freely. Their life has always been shaped by obligation. And so, even when freedom appears, it feels unfamiliar, almost unsafe. This keynote reveals a difficult truth. Becoming responsible too early interrupts emotional development. The child learns how to function, but not how to feel. Emotions are postponed, deferred, or quietly stored away. There was no time to process fear, sadness, or anger. There were tasks to complete, roles to fulfill. And those emotions do not disappear. They wait. Years later, they surface unexpectedly, often as anxiety, numbness, or unexplained guilt. The adult wonders what is wrong with them, never realizing they are meeting emotions that were delayed, not denied. Premature adulthood also distorts self-worth. The person learns to measure their value by how much they can handle. They feel useful when they are needed, but empty when they are not. Rest feels undeserved. Support feels uncomfortable. Receiving care creates unease because giving was always safer than receiving. This is not independence, it is self-neglect disguised as strength. And it often leads to relationships where the individual becomes the caretaker again, repeating a familiar role in a new setting. This keynote is not about diminishing resilience. Those who grew up too fast are capable, insightful, and deeply perceptive. But resilience should not require constant sacrifice. Strength should not demand self-erasure. The child who became the adult too soon deserves recognition, not for what they endured, but for what they lost. Lost moments of carelessness, lost permission to be unsure, lost the safety of being held instead of holding everything together. Healing begins when responsibility is questioned, when the adult asks, "What am I carrying that was never mine?" And slowly, deliberately, they begin to put it down. This does not mean abandoning values or becoming careless. It means allowing space for softness, allowing mistakes, allowing dependence without shame. It means learning that adulthood does not require constant control and that vulnerability is not regression. It is restoration. There comes a moment when the child inside no longer needs to perform maturity to earn safety, when play, rest, and curiosity are no longer luxuries but necessities. And in that moment, something profound happens. The adult does not become weaker, they become whole. Because true maturity is not how early you learn to endure, it is how fully you allow yourself to live. Breaking the inherited shadow. Every family carries a shadow, not something spoken about openly, not something written down, but something passed quietly from one generation to the next. It lives in habits, in reactions, in what is avoided and what is enforced. As a child, you did not choose this shadow. You were born into it. You learned its shape before you learned its name. You absorbed patterns without understanding their origin. And for a long time, you believed these patterns were simply you, your temperament, your flaws, your limits. But what you were actually carrying was history, unresolved, unnamed, and unconfronted. Breaking an inherited shadow does not begin with rebellion. It begins with awareness, with the moment you realize that certain fears did not start with you, that certain reactions feel older than your own experiences, that certain emotional responses appear automatically, even when the present moment does not justify them. This realization can be unsettling because it challenges the story you were told about yourself. It forces you to ask uncomfortable questions. Why do I react this way? Why does calm feel unfamiliar? Why does safety make me uneasy? These questions are not accusations. They are invitations to see clearly. The most difficult part of breaking the cycle is accepting that explanation does not equal obligation. Understanding where patterns come from does not mean you must continue them. Loyalty to family history does not require loyalty to its wounds. And yet, many adults remain trapped because they confuse change with betrayal. They believe that choosing a different path dishonors the past. In reality, it heals it. Because the greatest respect you can offer those before you is not imitation, it is evolution. Inherited shadows thrive in the unconscious. They lose strength when brought into awareness. When you notice how you respond to conflict, how you relate to authority, how you approach intimacy, you begin to see the blueprint you were given. And once you see it, you gain choice. Not instant freedom, but direction. You begin to pause instead of react, to reflect instead of repeat, to respond with intention rather than instinct. This is not easy work. It requires patience, humility, and courage, because it means standing between what was and what could be. Breaking the shadow also requires grief. Grief for the childhood that was shaped by forces you did not control. Grief for the versions of yourself that learned to survive instead of thrive. This grief is not weakness, it is honesty, and honesty is the foundation of transformation. You cannot build a new future while pretending the past did not matter. You must acknowledge what was lost, not to remain there, but to release its hold on you. As the cycle begins to break, a subtle shift occurs. You stop expecting the world to repeat the past. You stop interpreting neutrality as danger. You stop mistaking intensity for connection. Your nervous system learns a new language, one of steadiness rather than alertness. You begin to choose relationships that feel consistent rather than dramatic. You create boundaries not as walls, but as clarity. And slowly, the shadow that once defined your emotional landscape becomes smaller, less dominant, less commanding. This keynote is not about perfection. You will still stumble, old patterns will still appear under stress, but the difference is this: you will recognize them, and recognition changes everything, because what is seen can be interrupted, what is named can be softened, what is understood can be reshaped. You are no longer acting from inheritance alone, you are acting from awareness. And this is where the true power lies. Not in denying where you came from, but in choosing where you are going. You are not here to carry every unfinished burden forward. You are here to end what no longer serves, to model what was missing, to become the pause in the pattern. When you do this, the shadow does not disappear. It transforms. It becomes a lesson rather than a legacy, a reference rather than a ruler.